The rope burns on Ophelia Kimball's wrists were nothing compared to the fear clawing at her chest as she stood before the makeshift military tribunal in the dusty square of Jordan Valley, Oregon, where the August sun of 1865 beat down mercilessly on her dark hair. The war had officially ended months ago, but out here in the remote territories, old wounds festered like infected bullet holes, and accusations flew faster than rattlesnakes striking at shadows. "You stand accused of espionage against the Union Army," Colonel Hartwell declared, his weathered face twisted with barely concealed rage as he slammed his fist on the wooden table that served as the judge's bench. "Witnesses have testified that you provided aid and comfort to Confederate soldiers, shared intelligence about Union troop movements, and deliberately sabotaged our medical supplies." Ophelia's green eyes blazed with defiance despite the trembling in her legs. "I am a nurse, not a spy. I treated wounded men on both sides because that is what a healer does. I took an oath to preserve life, not to play politics with suffering." The crowd that had gathered in the square murmured and shifted. Some faces sympathetic, others hard as the desert rocks that surrounded their small town. Jordan Valley had seen its share of bloodshed during the war years, even though the major battles had been fought far to the east. The conflicts here had been smaller, more personal, and infinitely more bitter because neighbors had turned against neighbors, brothers against brothers. "Lies!" shouted a man from the crowd, his face purple with anger. "My son died because Confederate raiders knew exactly where our supply wagons would be. She told them." Ophelia turned toward the voice, her heart breaking at the raw grief she saw there. "Mr. Patterson, I held your son's hand when he died. I gave him water and morphine to ease his passing. I sang hymns with him so he wouldn't be afraid. I would never have done anything to cause his death or anyone else's." Before Colonel Hartwell could respond, a tall figure pushed through the crowd with the easy confidence of a man who knew how to handle himself in any situation. Owen Elridge was a cowboy through and through, from his dusty leather boots to his sun-bleached hat, from the well-worn holster at his hip to the rope burns on his calloused hands. He had spent the war years driving cattle north to feed the Western territories, staying deliberately neutral in a conflict he saw as madness, and in those years he had developed a reputation as a man whose word was as solid as iron. "Colonel, if I might have a word," Owen said, his deep voice cutting through the noise of the crowd with the kind of authority that came not from rank but from respect earned through years of hard living and fair dealing. Hartwell's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Elridge, this is a military matter. Unless you have relevant testimony, I suggest you step back." "That's exactly what I have, Colonel. Relevant testimony." Owen stepped up to the makeshift tribunal, pulling off his hat to reveal dark blonde hair and eyes the color of whiskey held up to lamplight. "I was there at the Battle of Crooked Creek Pass 2 years back. Saw this woman with my own eyes working in a field hospital that treated men from both armies. She wasn't choosing sides. She was choosing to save lives." Ophelia's breath caught in her throat. She remembered that terrible day, remembered the endless stream of bleeding, dying men, remembered working until her hands were covered in blood and her eyes burned with exhaustion. But she didn't remember seeing this cowboy, this stranger who now stood between her and the gallows. "One incident doesn't prove innocence," Hartwell said coldly. "It could have been a cover for her real activities." "Then let me tell you about the time at Silver Ridge," Owen continued, his voice steady and clear. "Winter of '63, a Confederate patrol got caught in a blizzard, half frozen, 2 of them with gangrene setting in. Miss Kimball here risked her own life to bring them to shelter, operated on them by candlelight, saved both their lives. Then, not 3 days later, she did the same thing for a Union sergeant who had been shot during a skirmish. Treated them in the same room, made them shake hands before she'd give them any food." A ripple of surprised laughter ran through the crowd, and Ophelia felt tears pricking at her eyes. She did remember that, remembered the stubborn defiance of both wounded soldiers, remembered telling them they could either behave like civilized human beings or freeze to death like fools. How do you know all this? Hartwell demanded. You said yourself you stayed neutral during the war. Why were you at these places? Owen met the colonel's gaze without flinching. Because cattle still needed moving, Colonel. Wars don't stop the business of living. I delivered beef to military outposts on both sides when the price was right, and I saw what I saw. This woman isn't a spy. She's a healer who didn't let politics interfere with her conscience. He's telling the truth. Another voice rang out from the crowd, and an older man with a grizzled beard pushed forward. I was one of those men at Silver Ridge, Confederate Second Lieutenant Marcus Webb. I'm not proud of everything I did during the war, but I know mercy when I see it. And this woman showed mercy to everyone, regardless of the color of their uniform. More voices began to join in, people stepping forward with their own stories. A woman whose brother had been saved by Ophelia's quick thinking when he'd been bitten by a rattlesnake. A rancher who had seen her ride through hostile territory to bring medicine to a remote settlement suffering from influenza. A former Union corporal who remembered her sitting up all night with a dying Confederate boy, writing a letter to his mother because his hands were too badly burned to hold a pen. Colonel Hartwell's expression began to shift, the rigid certainty giving way to doubt. He looked at Ophelia with new eyes, seeing perhaps not a traitor, but a woman who had tried to hold on to her humanity in the midst of inhumanity. These testimonies are compelling, he admitted slowly. But the evidence against you, Miss Kimball, includes documented instances where Confederate forces seem to have advanced knowledge of Union movements. How do you explain that? Ophelia straightened her shoulders, meeting his gaze directly. I cannot explain military intelligence failures, Colonel. What I can tell you is that I never, not once, shared information about troop movements with anyone. I barely paid attention to such things. My focus was on the wounded, on keeping them alive, on making sure they had clean bandages and enough morphine and someone to hold their hand when they were scared. If there were leaks, they didn't come from me. Owen spoke up again, his voice quiet but firm. Colonel, with respect, maybe the problem isn't that someone was leaking information. Maybe the problem is that in a territory this size, with this many people moving through, it's damn near impossible to keep anything secret. Cowboys like me, we see things. Traders, hunters, prospectors, they all see things. Information spreads like wildfire out here, not because of spies, but because people talk. Hartwell was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the table. Finally, he sighed heavily. Mr. Elridge, you make a fair point, and the weight of testimony here suggests that Miss Kimball's actions, while perhaps ill-advised in their neutrality, do not constitute espionage. He turned to Ophelia. Miss Kimball, I am dismissing the charges against you. However, I strongly suggest that in the future, you exercise more discretion in choosing which causes to support. Healing isn't a cause, Colonel, Ophelia said quietly. It's a calling. As the crowd began to disperse, some people shooting apologetic glances at Ophelia while others still muttered darkly, Owen stayed close to her side. When someone moved to untie her wrists, he was the one who stepped forward, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he worked at the knots. Thank you, Ophelia whispered, her voice hoarse with emotion. You saved my life today. Just told the truth, madam, Owen replied, his amber eyes meeting hers. Seemed like the right thing to do. But why? She asked, as the ropes fell away and she rubbed at her sore wrists. You don't know me. We've never even spoken before. Owen was quiet for a moment, coiling the rope in his hands. I've been watching you for near about 2 years now, he admitted. Not in a strange way, just... I've been in Jordan Valley on and off bringing cattle through, and I've seen the work you do. Seen how you treat everyone the same, whether they're rich or poor, Union or Confederate, white or Indian. Takes a special kind of courage to stand by your principles like that, especially when it makes you unpopular. Ophelia felt warmth spreading through her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in so long she'd almost forgotten what it was like. During the war years, she had been too busy, too exhausted, too focused on survival to think about anything like romance or attraction. But now, looking up into Owen Elridge's honest face, she felt something shift inside her. Will you walk with me? She asked impulsively. I need to get away from this square, from all these people staring at me. It would be my honor, Miss Kimball. They walked in silence through the dusty streets of Jordan Valley, past the general store and the saloon, past the blacksmith shop where the hammer rang against the anvil in a steady rhythm. The town was small, barely 200 souls, but it served as a crucial stop for travelers heading west or north, and as a gathering point for the scattered ranches and homesteads that dotted the harsh but beautiful landscape. Finally, they reached the edge of town where the desert stretched out in all directions, broken only by the distant mountains and the winding line of green that marked the course of the Jordan Creek. Ophelia sank down onto a large rock, suddenly exhausted, all the fear and adrenaline draining out of her at once. "I thought I was going to hang," she said, her voice breaking. "I really thought this was the end." Owen sat down beside her, maintaining a respectful distance but close enough that she could feel the solid comfort of his presence. "I wouldn't have let that happen." "You couldn't have stopped it if the colonel had decided differently." "Maybe not legally," Owen said, and there was something in his tone that made Ophelia look at him sharply. He shrugged. "I've done a lot of things in my life, Miss Kimball. Not all of them were strictly within the bounds of the law, but I've always tried to do what's right. And letting an innocent woman hang would definitely not have been right." Ophelia didn't know whether to be alarmed or touched by this admission. "You would have broken me out? If it came to that." "You don't even know me," she repeated, bewildered. Owen turned to look at her, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "I know enough. I know you're brave and compassionate and stubborn as a mule. I know you value human life above politics and pride. I know you've probably saved hundreds of lives with your nursing, and the world would be a darker place without you in it." Ophelia felt tears spilling down her cheeks, and she didn't try to stop them. For so long, she had been viewed with suspicion and hostility, accused of betrayal, spat at in the streets by people who saw her neutrality as treason. To hear someone speak of her with such respect, such admiration, was almost more than she could bear. "I'm sorry," she said, wiping at her face. "I don't usually cry. You just faced down a military tribunal and nearly got yourself hanged. I think you're entitled to a few tears." They sat together as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold and deep purple. Slowly, Ophelia began to talk, telling Owen things she had never told anyone before. She spoke of growing up in Philadelphia, the daughter of a doctor who had taught her everything he knew about medicine. She told him about coming west with her husband 5 years ago, full of dreams about starting a new life on the frontier. "He died of cholera during our first winter here," she said quietly. "I had all of my medical knowledge, all of my training, and I couldn't save him. After that, I threw myself into nursing. It was the only thing that made sense, the only thing that gave me purpose. When the war started, people expected me to choose a side, but I couldn't. I just couldn't. How could I decide that one man's life was worth more than another's based on the color of his uniform?" Owen listened without interrupting, his presence solid and comforting beside her. When she finally fell silent, he spoke softly. "My parents died when I was 16. Comanche raid. I was out checking the cattle when it happened, came back to find our ranch burned and them gone. I've carried the guilt of that for 14 years, wondering if I could have made a difference if I'd been there." "You were 16, Ophelia said, turning to him. "You would have died too. Maybe, probably, but knowing that doesn't make the guilt go away." He picked up a small stone, turning it over in his fingers. "After that, I became a cowboy. Figured if I kept moving, kept working, I wouldn't have time to think too much about what I'd lost. But the truth is, I've been lonely. Real lonely. Seeing you today, watching you stand up there with such dignity and courage, it made me realize I'm tired of being alone." Ophelia's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. "Owen, we barely know each other." "Then let's change that," he said, turning to face her fully. "Stay in Jordan Valley. Let me court you properly. If after a few months you decide I'm not the man for you, I'll tip my hat and wish you well. But if there's even a chance that we could build something together, don't you think it's worth exploring?" It was impulsive and reckless, and completely unlike the careful, practical woman Ophelia had become over the years. But something in Owen's earnest face, in the gentleness of his hands and the steadiness of his gaze, made her want to take the risk. "All right," she said softly, "let's see where this leads." Over the following weeks, Owen proved to be a man of his word. He courted Ophelia with old-fashioned courtesy, showing up at her small cabin with wildflowers he'd picked from the desert, bringing her fresh meat from his hunts, fixing the broken shutters on her windows and the loose boards on her porch. They went for long walks together, exploring the land around Jordan Valley. And with each conversation, Ophelia found herself falling a little more in love with this quiet, honorable cowboy. Owen told her about his work, about the long cattle drives that took him away for weeks or months at a time, about sleeping under the stars and facing down stampedes and river crossings and all the dangers that came with moving half-wild cattle across hundreds of miles of untamed country. He spoke of the beauty of the open range, of sunrises that set the whole world on fire and storms that rolled across the plains like armies of gods. In turn, Ophelia shared more of her own experiences, the medical emergencies she had handled, the satisfaction of seeing a patient recover against all odds, the heartbreak of losing someone despite her best efforts. She showed him her medical journals, the careful notes she kept on every case, the sketches she had made of various injuries and treatments. "You're a scientist," Owen said admiringly, paging through one of her journals. "This is real medical research." "It's just what my father taught me," Ophelia said, but she was pleased by his interest. He always said that medicine advances through careful observation and documentation. Every case teaches you something if you're willing to learn from it. One evening, about 6 weeks after the trial, they were sitting on Ophelia's porch, watching the sunset, when Owen reached over and took her hand. It was the first time he had touched her beyond helping her over rough ground or offering his arm for support, and the contact sent electricity racing up Ophelia's arm. "I'm falling in love with you," he said simply. "I wanted you to know that. I'm not expecting you to say it back, not yet, but I needed to be honest about where my heart is headed." Ophelia squeezed his hand, her throat tight with emotion. "Owen, I'm scared. I lost my husband, and it nearly destroyed me. The thought of opening myself up to that kind of pain again." "I know," he said gently, "and I can't promise you that nothing bad will ever happen. Life out here is hard and dangerous, and there are no guarantees. But I can promise you that I'll do everything in my power to build a good life with you, to be faithful and true, to support your work and your dreams. And I can promise you that loving someone, really loving them, is worth the risk of losing them." Tears were streaming down Ophelia's face again, but this time they were tears of hope rather than fear. "I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered. "God help me, I'm falling so hard." Owen stood up, pulling her gently to her feet. And then his arms were around her and his lips were on hers, and Ophelia felt like she was coming home after a long journey through hostile territory. The kiss was everything a kiss should be, tender and passionate and full of promise. And when they finally broke apart, both of them were breathless. "Marry me," Owen said, his forehead resting against hers. "I know it's fast, but out here life is too short and too uncertain to waste time. Marry me, Ophelia. Let me be your husband and your partner and your best friend for whatever time we're given." "Yes," Ophelia said without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were wed 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Jordan Valley. Ophelia wore a dress she had sewn herself from blue calico, and Owen wore his best shirt and a new vest he had purchased specially for the occasion. The same people who had gathered to watch her trial now gathered to celebrate her wedding, and the transformation in their attitudes was remarkable. It seemed that Owen's testimony and her exoneration had changed how the town viewed her, and several people who had been coldest toward her made a point of congratulating her and wishing her happiness. Former Lieutenant Webb attended the wedding, and he pulled Ophelia aside before the ceremony began. "I owe you my life, Miss Kimball, and I've never forgotten it. I'm glad to see you finding happiness. You deserve it more than anyone I know." "Thank you, Marcus," Ophelia said, using his first name for the first time. "And thank you for speaking up at the trial. Your testimony made a difference." "It was the least I could do. The war's over now, and it's time we all remembered how to be decent human beings again." The wedding celebration was lively, with fiddle music and dancing and food contributed by half the town. Owen swept Ophelia around in dance after dance, his eyes never leaving her face, and she felt more joy than she had experienced in years. When the party finally wound down late that night, Owen carried her across the threshold of his ranch house, a sturdy structure he had built himself over the years, located about 5 miles outside of town. "Welcome home, Mrs. Elridge," he said, setting her down gently in the main room. Ophelia looked around at the simple but well-built interior, at the stone fireplace, and the handmade furniture, and the windows that looked out over the rangeland. "It's perfect," she said honestly, "but I'll need to set up a proper medical area. People will still need nursing, and I can't abandon that work." "I wouldn't expect you to," Owen said, pulling her close. "We'll convert the spare room into a clinic. I'll help you set it up however you need it. Your calling is part of who you are, and I love all of who you are." That night, as they lay together in Owen's bed, Ophelia marveled at how much her life had changed in just a few short months. From facing execution to finding love, from being viewed as a traitor to being welcomed as a valued member of the community, the transformation seemed almost magical, but she knew it wasn't magic. It was the result of one man's courage in speaking the truth, and two people's willingness to take a chance on love despite all the reasons to be cautious. "What are you thinking?" Owen asked, his arm warm around her shoulders. "I'm thinking about how you saved me," Ophelia said softly. "Not just from the gallows, but from a life of isolation and fear. You gave me hope again, Owen. You reminded me that there's still goodness in the world." "You saved me too," Owen replied. "I was just existing before I met you, going through the motions of living without really feeling alive. Now everything is different. Everything matters more." They made love then, slowly and tenderly, learning each other's bodies and preferences, creating new memories to overlay the old hurts and losses. Afterward, Ophelia fell asleep in her husband's arms, feeling safer and more content than she had in years. The next few months were an adjustment as they learned to live together, to navigate the compromises and communications that any marriage requires. Owen was often away for days at a time, working with his small crew to manage his cattle herd, and Ophelia threw herself into establishing her medical practice. Word spread quickly that she was available for consultations, and people began coming from miles around seeking treatment for everything from broken bones to difficult childbirths to chronic ailments. Owen was endlessly supportive, building shelves for her medical supplies, constructing a proper examination table, even learning basic first aid so he could assist her when needed. He never complained about the patients who showed up at all hours, never begrudged the time and energy Ophelia devoted to her work. One cold November evening, a rancher named Peterson arrived at their door. The same man whose son had died during the war and who had accused Ophelia at her trial. He stood on the porch looking uncomfortable, his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Elridge, I need your help," he said, the words clearly difficult for him. "My daughter's in labor, and something's wrong. The baby won't come, and she's bleeding. I know I have no right to ask you for anything after what I said at your trial, but please, she's all I have left." Ophelia didn't hesitate. She grabbed her medical bag and followed Peterson to his ranch, with Owen riding alongside to provide support. When they arrived, she found a young woman in desperate straits, the baby positioned wrong, and the mother exhausted from hours of failed labor. "I need to turn the baby," Ophelia said calmly, scrubbing her hands. "It's going to be painful, but it's the only way. Owen, I need you to hold her shoulders. Mr. Peterson, you hold her hand and keep her calm." For the next hour, Ophelia worked with focused intensity, using all her skill and knowledge to manipulate the baby into the correct position. The young woman screamed in pain, and Peterson wept openly, but Ophelia never wavered. Finally, blessedly, the baby shifted and descended, and moments later a healthy boy slipped into Ophelia's waiting hands. "You have a grandson," Ophelia said, placing the crying infant on his mother's chest, "and your daughter is going to be fine." Peterson looked at Ophelia with tears streaming down his weathered face. "I'm sorry," he choked out. "I'm so sorry for what I said, for what I accused you of. You're an angel, Mrs. Elridge, a true angel." "I'm just a nurse," Ophelia said gently, "and I hold no grudges, Mr. Peterson. Your grief was understandable. I'm just glad I could help today." As they rode home through the cold night, Owen put his arm around Ophelia's waist. "You were magnificent back there," he said. "I've never seen anything like it. The way you stayed so calm and focused, even when everything was going wrong." "It's what I was trained to do," Ophelia said, but she leaned into his warmth gratefully. "Though I admit having you there made it easier. Knowing you believed in me, that you had my back, gave me confidence." "Always," Owen promised. "I'll always have your back. Ophelia, no matter what." Winter settled over Jordan Valley with surprising gentleness that year, cold but not brutal, with enough snow to make the landscape beautiful, but not enough to create hardship. Owen continued his work with the cattle, though the pace slowed during the winter months, and Ophelia's medical practice flourished. She treated frostbite and influenza, set broken bones from slips on icy ground, and delivered 3 more babies before spring arrived. In March, Ophelia realized she had missed her monthly courses. At first she attributed it to stress or the hard work of the winter, but when the pattern continued and she began experiencing morning nausea, she realized she was pregnant. The knowledge filled her with a complex mix of emotions, joy and fear and wonder, all tangled together. She waited until she was certain before telling Owen, choosing a quiet evening when they were alone by the fire. "I have news," she said, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat belly. "We're going to have a baby." Owen's face went through a rapid series of expressions, shock giving way to joy, giving way to concern. "Are you all right? Is everything as it should be?" Ophelia laughed, touched by his worry. "Everything is fine. I'm healthy and strong, and I know exactly what to expect and how to care for myself, but yes, sometime in October you're going to be a father." Owen pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "I'm going to be a father," he repeated, wonder in his voice. "We're going to have a child together." "Are you happy?" Ophelia asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Owen said, pulling back to look at her face. "Terrified too, if I'm being honest, but mostly just overwhelmed with love for you and for this little life we've created." As Ophelia's pregnancy progressed through the spring and summer, Owen became almost comically protective. He insisted on doing all the heavy lifting, worried constantly about her getting enough rest and proper nutrition, and nearly drove her crazy with his hovering. "Owen, I'm pregnant, not dying," Ophelia finally said in exasperation one day when he tried to prevent her from treating a patient with a simple case of poison oak. "I'm still perfectly capable of doing my work." I know," Owen said sheepishly. "I just worry. I can't help it." "Then worry quietly," Ophelia said, but she softened the words with a kiss. "I love that you care so much, but you have to trust me to know my own limits." Owen did his best to back off, though Ophelia could see the effort it cost him. But as her belly swelled and her movements became more awkward, she had to admit that his help was increasingly welcome. By September, she had cut back significantly on her practice, taking only emergency cases and referring routine matters to a young doctor who had recently arrived in town. On a beautiful October morning, when the leaves on the cottonwoods along the creek had turned gold and the air smelled of autumn, Ophelia woke to her first contractions. She had attended enough births to know that labor could take many hours, especially with a first child, so she didn't immediately wake Owen. Instead, she moved quietly around the cabin, timing the contractions and making final preparations. It was only when the contractions became regular and more intense that she shook Owen awake. "It's time," she said simply. Owen shot out of bed like he'd been fired from a cannon, immediately in a panic. "What do I do? Should I get the doctor? Should I boil water? What do you need?" Despite the pain, Ophelia had to laugh. "Owen, calm down. Yes, get the doctor, but don't break your neck riding into town. And yes, we'll need hot water and clean linens, but there's time. This is going to take a while." Owen rode to town at a pace that was probably not as careful as Ophelia would have liked, returning with Dr. Morrison and also with 2 experienced midwives from town who had offered to assist. Ophelia was grateful for their presence, for though she knew the theory of childbirth inside and out, experiencing it herself was entirely different from attending other women. Labor proved long and difficult, lasting through the day and into the night. Owen stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement when the pain became almost unbearable. There were moments when Ophelia felt like she couldn't continue, when the agony was so intense she wanted to give up, but Owen's steady presence anchored her. "You can do this," he kept saying. "You're the strongest woman I know. Just a little longer, my love. Just a little longer." Finally, as the clock struck midnight, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that filled the cabin with sound and joy. Dr. Morrison placed the baby on Ophelia's chest, and she looked down at the tiny, perfect face with overwhelming love. "A boy," Owen said, his voice choked with emotion. "We have a son." "What should we name him?" Ophelia asked, studying her baby's features, seeing hints of both herself and Owen in the small face. "I was thinking, Thomas," Owen said, "after your father. You've told me so many stories about him, about how much he meant to you. I'd be honored to name our son after him." Ophelia's eyes filled with tears. "Thomas Elridge. It's perfect." The midwives helped clean up and get Ophelia and the baby settled comfortably, then departed with promises to check in the next day. Dr. Morrison stayed a bit longer, examining both mother and child and pronouncing them healthy, before he too took his leave. Finally, Owen and Ophelia were alone with their son. "I can't believe he's real," Owen whispered, carefully holding Thomas while Ophelia rested. "He's so small and perfect." "He has your nose," Ophelia observed with a tired smile. "And your chin," Owen countered, "and hopefully your intelligence and compassion." "And your courage and integrity," Ophelia added. They sat together in the lamplight, marveling at the miracle they had created, making plans and dreaming dreams about the future. Thomas would grow up here in this wild, beautiful country, learning to ride and rope from his father, learning healing arts from his mother, carrying forward the best of both of them. The months after Thomas's birth were exhausting but joyful. Ophelia was amazed by how much work one small baby could generate, but Owen proved to be a devoted father, getting up for nighttime feedings, changing diapers without complaint, walking the floor for hours when Thomas was colicky. They worked as a team, supporting each other through the challenges of new parenthood. When Thomas was 6 months old, Ophelia gradually began taking medical cases again, starting slowly and building back up as she regained her strength and adjusted to balancing motherhood with her calling. Owen built an addition onto the cabin specifically to serve as a clinic, with a separate entrance so patients wouldn't disturb the family areas. One spring afternoon when Thomas was toddling around on chubby legs, Marcus Webb rode up to the ranch. Ophelia hadn't seen him since the wedding, and she was surprised but pleased to greet him. "Marcus, what brings you out this way?" "I heard you'd had a baby," Marcus said, swinging down from his horse. "Wanted to come pay my respects and bring a gift." He produced a beautifully carved wooden horse, clearly handmade with great care, for the little one. "It's beautiful," Ophelia said, accepting the toy. "Thomas will love it. Please come in and have some coffee." Over coffee, Marcus explained that he had settled on a small ranch about 20 miles north. He had married a widow with 2 children and was trying to build a peaceful life after the violence of the war years. "Sometimes I still have nightmares," he admitted, "about the battles, about the men I killed. But working the land, raising the children, loving my wife, it helps. It reminds me that there's more to life than violence and conflict." That's all any of us can do, Ophelia said gently. Move forward, try to make amends where we can, build something good out of the rubble of the past. You did that, Marcus said. You took everything the war threw at you, all the accusations and hatred and fear, and you came through it with your compassion intact. You inspire me, Ophelia. You remind me that it's possible to hold on to your humanity even when everything around you is inhuman. After Marcus left, Ophelia thought about his words for a long time. She had never considered herself particularly inspiring or heroic. She had simply done what she believed was right, treating wounded soldiers regardless of their allegiance, refusing to let politics override her medical ethics. But perhaps, she thought, that was its own kind of heroism. Perhaps holding on to your principles in the face of overwhelming pressure was as brave as any battlefield courage. That evening, she shared Marcus's visit with Owen as they watched Thomas play with his new wooden horse. He's right, Owen said. You are inspiring. You changed this whole town with your example. Do you know how many people have told me that watching you stand up at that trial, seeing you maintain your dignity and your principles even when you were facing death, made them reconsider their own prejudices and hatreds? I wasn't trying to make a statement, Ophelia protested. I was just trying to survive. The best statements are made by people who are just trying to do what's right without worrying about the audience, Owen said. You lived your values, and people noticed. That matters. As the years passed, the Elridge family flourished. Thomas grew into a bright, curious boy who showed an early interest in both ranching and medicine. When he was 4, Ophelia gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah, a quiet child with Owen's amber eyes and a thoughtful disposition. 2 years after that came another son, James, who was boisterous and fearless and kept them all on their toes. The ranch prospered as well. Owen's reputation for honest dealing and quality cattle spread throughout the region, and he was able to expand his herd and hire additional hands. Ophelia's medical practice remained busy, and she trained several young women in nursing skills, creating a network of caregivers throughout the county. Jordan Valley grew too, from a small outpost to a thriving town with a proper school, a newspaper, and regular stage service. The bitter divisions of the war years gradually faded, though they never disappeared entirely. But Ophelia's presence, her continuing commitment to treating everyone equally regardless of their history or politics, served as a constant reminder that compassion was possible even in difficult times. One summer evening when Thomas was 12, Sarah was 8, and James was 6, the family gathered on the porch after dinner to watch the sunset. It had become their tradition, this quiet time together at the end of the day, and Ophelia treasured it. "Tell us the story again," Sarah asked, as she often did, "about how Papa saved you from hanging." Ophelia and Owen exchanged glances, and Ophelia saw the same love in his eyes that had been there all those years ago when he first testified at her trial. "Well," Owen began, launching into the familiar tale, "your mother was standing there in the town square accused of being a spy, and I knew I couldn't let an injustice happen without speaking up." The children listened raptly, even though they had heard the story dozens of times. Thomas interrupted occasionally with questions about the specific events, his analytical mind already showing signs of the doctor he would someday become. Sarah wanted to know about the emotions, about how scared Ophelia had been, and how brave Owen had been. James just loved the dramatic aspects, the near miss of the hanging, the dramatic rescue. After the story was done and the children had been sent to bed, Owen and Ophelia remained on the porch, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting on his chest. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been," Ophelia asked, "if you hadn't spoken up that day, if the trial had gone differently?" "I try not to," Owen admitted. "It's too terrible to contemplate. But I'll tell you what I do think about. I think about how lucky I am that I found the courage to step forward. I could have stayed silent, told myself it wasn't my business, convinced myself that someone else would speak up. But something pushed me forward, some instinct that said this mattered, that you mattered. I'm grateful every day," Ophelia said. "Not just that you saved my life, but that you saw me, really saw me, not as a traitor or a spy or even just as a nurse, but as a whole person worthy of love and respect. That's because you are worthy of love and respect, Owen said, kissing the top of her head. More than anyone I've ever known. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. A coyote called in the distance, and somewhere closer one of the horses whinnied softly. These were the sounds of their life, the soundtrack to their daily existence in this wild, beautiful country they called home. "We should expand the clinic," Ophelia said suddenly. "Train more nurses, maybe even try to recruit another doctor. The county is growing and people need more medical resources than I can provide alone." "Whatever you want to do, I'll support you," Owen said. "We have the money now to make it happen, and I know it would make you happy to pass on your knowledge to a new generation." Over the next year, they did exactly that. Owen funded the construction of a proper clinic building in town, with multiple examination rooms, a small surgery, and residential space for medical students. Ophelia recruited 3 young women and 1 young man who were interested in nursing, teaching them everything she knew about medicine, surgery, and patient care. Dr. Morrison, who was getting on in years, was thrilled to have additional help and began training the young man, whose name was David, to eventually take over his practice. The clinic became a point of pride for Jordan Valley, drawing patients from 100 miles in every direction and establishing the town as a center for medical care in the region. When Thomas turned 16, he announced his intention to attend medical school back east, wanting to get the same kind of formal training his mother had received from his grandfather. It was bittersweet for Ophelia to see her eldest son leave, but she was immensely proud of his ambition and dedication. "You'll do great things," she told him the day he left on the stage, "and you'll make a difference in people's lives, just like your grandfather did." "I want to be like you, Ma," Thomas said, hugging her tightly. "I want to treat people with compassion and skill regardless of who they are or where they come from. You taught me that, you and Pa both." After Thomas left, the house felt quieter, but life continued its busy pace. Sarah showed an aptitude for teaching and began helping at the schoolhouse, while James decided he wanted to be a rancher like his father. Owen taught James everything about cattle ranching, taking him along on drives and teaching him to read the land and the weather and the animals. One October evening, nearly 20 years after that terrifying day in the town square, Ophelia and Owen took a ride out to the place where they had first sat together after her trial. The rock was still there, unchanged by time, and they dismounted to sit on it just as they had all those years ago. "Do you remember what you said to me that day?" Ophelia asked, looking out over the desert that glowed gold and orange in the setting sun. "I said I'd been watching you for 2 years, Owen replied, "that I admired your courage and your principles." "You said the world would be a darker place without me in it," Ophelia said softly. "That's what really got to me. The idea that my life mattered to someone, that someone saw value in what I was trying to do." "Your life matters more than you'll ever know," Owen said. "Think about all the people you've saved over the years, all the babies you've delivered, all the illnesses you've treated. Every one of those people has gone on to live their lives, to have their own children, to make their own contributions. The ripple effect of your work is incalculable." "Our work," Ophelia corrected. "I couldn't have done any of it without your support. You believed in me when almost no one else did. You gave me the security and freedom to pursue my calling. Everything I've accomplished, we've accomplished together." They watched the sun sink below the mountains, the sky turning deep purple and then indigo as the first stars appeared. The desert air grew cold, but they lingered, neither wanting to break the spell of the moment. "Do you know what I love most about our life?" Owen asked eventually. "It's not the ranch or the cattle or even the children, though I love all of that. It's the partnership. The way we've built something together that neither of us could have built alone. The way we complement each other, support each other, challenge each other to be better." "I love that too," Ophelia said. "I love that we're still learning about each other even after all these years. I love that I can still surprise you and you can still surprise me. I love that our love keeps growing instead of stagnating." They rode home through the darkness, their horses moving sure-footedly along the familiar trail. When they arrived at the ranch, lights glowed in the windows, and they could see Sarah and James moving around inside, probably starting on dinner. It was a scene of domestic contentment, the kind of life Ophelia had never imagined she would have during those dark days of the war. The years continued to roll by, bringing changes both joyful and sorrowful. Thomas returned from medical school with his degree and a quiet, intelligent wife named Rebecca. They settled in a larger town 50 miles away where Thomas opened a practice, but they visited often, and Ophelia delighted in watching her son practice medicine with the same compassion and skill she had tried to instill in him. Sarah married a teacher from back east, a gentleman named Robert who had come west seeking adventure, and found love instead. They remained in Jordan Valley, and Sarah took over the schoolhouse completely, transforming it into one of the best schools in the territory. James married his childhood sweetheart, a rancher's daughter named Elizabeth, and they built their own ranch on land adjacent to Owen's, creating a family compound that would remain in the Elridge family for generations. Dr. Morrison passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 83, and David, now a fully trained doctor himself, took over the practice seamlessly. Ophelia gradually reduced her own medical work, focusing more on teaching and mentoring the next generation of healers rather than doing direct patient care. When Owen turned 60, he handed over day-to-day management of the ranch to James, though he still rode out most days to check on the cattle and offer advice. He and Ophelia had more time to themselves, and they used it to travel, visiting San Francisco and Portland and Denver, seeing sights they had only read about in newspapers, but they always came back to Jordan Valley, to the ranch and the clinic and the town that had become their home. This was where they belonged, where they had built their life together, where their children and grandchildren were creating their own families and their own legacies. One warm spring morning when Ophelia was 68 and Owen was 70, they sat on their porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard. There were 9 of them now, ranging in age from 3 to 16, a rowdy, loving bunch who kept everyone young with their energy and curiosity. "We did good," Owen said quietly, reaching over to take Ophelia's hand. "Look at what we created. Not just the children and grandchildren, though they're the best part, but the whole community. The clinic, the school, the ranch, the values we've tried to instill." "We did do good," Ophelia agreed, squeezing his hand, "though there were times I wasn't sure we'd make it. That first year especially, learning to live together, learning to trust each other fully. Best decision I ever made. Testifying at your trial," Owen said, "changed my whole life trajectory. If I hadn't found the courage to speak up that day, I would have missed out on all of this, on you, on our family, on the life we've built together." "I was just thinking," Ophelia said, "about that day when you asked me to marry you. You said that loving someone is worth the risk of losing them. Do you still believe that?" "More than ever," Owen said firmly. "Every moment of joy, every shared triumph, every child and grandchild, every sunset we've watched together, it's all been worth whatever pain the future might hold. Love isn't about avoiding loss. It's about cherishing what you have while you have it." Ophelia leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the same surge of love she had felt all those years ago when this cowboy had stepped forward to save her life. He had given her so much more than physical salvation. He had given her hope, partnership, family, and a love that had sustained her through nearly 3 decades of marriage. As the afternoon sun warmed their faces and the grandchildren's laughter filled the air, Ophelia reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment, from accused spy to respected healer, from widow facing execution to wife and mother and grandmother. Her life had taken turns she never could have predicted. But through it all, one constant had remained: Owen Elridge, the cowboy who had looked past accusations and suspicion to see the truth of who she was. He had proved her innocence when it mattered most, but more importantly, he had loved her completely and unconditionally for more than half her life. The grandchildren ran up to the porch demanding stories, and Ophelia smiled, pulling the youngest onto her lap. She began to tell them about the old days, about field hospitals during the war, about riding through blizzards to reach patients, about a cowboy who had believed in her when no one else did. Owen added his own memories, embellishing the stories to make them more exciting for the children, and their voices mingled in the warm spring air. This was their legacy, Ophelia thought. Not just the buildings and businesses they had created, but the stories they were passing down, the values they were instilling, the example they were setting of what love and partnership could look like. As the sun began to set and the children were called home by their parents, Ophelia and Owen remained on the porch, his arm around her shoulders, her head on his chest, watching the sky turn brilliant shades of orange and pink. "I love you," Owen said, as he had said thousands of times over the years. "I love you too," Ophelia replied, the words as true and powerful as they had been the first time she spoke them. They sat together as darkness fell and the stars emerged. Two people who had found each other in the midst of chaos and accusation, who had built a life together based on truth and compassion and unwavering commitment. The Wild West had given them hardship and challenge, but it had also given them each other, and that had made all the difference. Years continued to pass, each one bringing its own mixture of joy and sorrow, triumph and challenge. Thomas's medical practice grew so successful that he took on 2 partners and opened a small hospital. Sarah and Robert had 4 children who all became teachers, spreading the value of education throughout the territory. James and Elizabeth had 5 children and expanded the ranch until it was one of the largest in the region. Ophelia continued to mentor young nurses even as her own health began to slow her down. She had always been robust and energetic, but the years of hard work and long hours finally caught up with her. Owen, too, felt the weight of his years, his joints stiffening from decades of hard riding and manual labor, but they faced aging together with the same partnership that had characterized their entire marriage, helping each other through the inevitable difficulties, celebrating each small victory, finding joy in the simple pleasures of sitting together holding hands, watching their family grow and flourish. On their 40th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered at the ranch for a massive celebration. Children and grandchildren came from across the territory, and even some great-grandchildren, tiny babies and toddlers who represented the newest generation of Elridges. The town of Jordan Valley declared it Owen and Ophelia Elridge Day, recognizing their contributions to the community over 4 decades. The celebration was held in the large barn, decorated with flowers and ribbons, and included a feast that took days to prepare. People came from miles around to honor the couple who had become legends in their own time, the nurse who had treated everyone equally, and the cowboy who had stood up for justice when it mattered most. Speech after speech praised their contributions, their character, their love. Former patients shared stories of how Ophelia had saved their lives or the lives of their loved ones. Ranchers talked about Owen's fairness and integrity in business dealings. Community leaders spoke of the clinic and the school and the values that the Elridges had instilled in the entire region. When it was finally Ophelia's turn to speak, she stood with Owen's hand in hers and looked out over the gathered crowd. She saw faces of all ages, multiple generations who had been touched by their lives and their work. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice still strong despite her years. "When I think back to that day 43 years ago when I stood accused in the town square, I never could have imagined this future. I thought my life was ending, but instead, it was just beginning. Owen gave me hope when I had none. He saw past fear and accusation to truth and compassion. And in doing so, he not only saved my life, he gave me the greatest gift anyone can receive, a partner to share life with, someone to love and be loved by through all the ups and downs." She turned to Owen, tears streaming down her lined face. "You have been my rock, my champion, my dearest friend, and my greatest love. Every good thing in my life has been made better by sharing it with you. Thank you for 40 years of partnership, of love, of building a life together that has mattered." Owen stood and pulled her into his arms, and the crowd erupted in applause and cheers. They kissed like the young lovers they had once been. and everyone in the barn felt the power of a love that had endured for 4 decades and showed no signs of diminishing. The celebration continued late into the night, with music and dancing and storytelling. Ophelia danced with Owen, with her sons, with her grandsons, her body remembering the joy of movement despite the aches of age. Owen was equally popular, swinging daughters and granddaughters around the floor with surprising energy. When they finally returned home in the early hours of the morning, exhausted but happy, they stood together in the doorway of the cabin they had shared for so long. 40 years, Owen marveled. Seems like a long time and no time at all. I'd do it all again, Ophelia said. Every challenge, every hardship, every sleepless night, all of it was worth it to have this life with you. Me too, Owen said, pulling her close. 1,000 times over, me too. They lived several more good years after that anniversary, years filled with family visits and quiet evenings, and the deep contentment that comes from a life well lived. Ophelia continued to offer medical advice to those who sought it, though she no longer practiced actively. Owen spent his days puttering around the ranch, offering guidance to James, but mostly just enjoying the work he had loved his entire adult life. When Ophelia was 76, she contracted pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter. Despite the best efforts of Thomas and David and all the modern medical knowledge available, her body was simply too worn out to fight off the infection. She died peacefully in her own bed, surrounded by her family, with Owen holding her hand. I love you, she whispered to him with her last breath. Thank you for everything. I love you too, Owen said through his tears. Thank you for 48 years of joy. Owen only survived her by 6 months. The doctor said it was his heart, weakened by decades of hard work and finally breaking under the weight of grief. But everyone who knew him understood that he had simply been unable to go on without his Ophelia, his nurse, his wife, his partner in all things. They were buried side by side in the Jordan Valley Cemetery, under a large cottonwood tree, with matching headstones that read simply, Owen Elridge, 1835-1913, and Ophelia Elridge, 1837-1913. Beloved parents, grandparents, and partners in love and life. The clinic Ophelia had founded continued to operate for generations, always with at least one Elridge family member involved in its management. The ranch James had inherited became one of the most successful in Oregon, passing down through his children and grandchildren. The school Sarah had nurtured produced educated citizens who went on to make their own marks on the world. But perhaps the most important legacy Owen and Ophelia left was not in buildings or institutions, but in the story they had created together. It was told and retold, passed down through generations, a tale of courage and compassion, of justice and love, of two people who had found each other in the midst of darkness and built a life together that lit the way for countless others. Young couples would visit their graves, holding hands and making promises to each other, inspired by the example of a love that had endured for nearly half a century. Nurses would invoke Ophelia's name when facing difficult ethical decisions, remembering how she had refused to let politics override compassion. Ranchers would speak of Owen's integrity as the standard to which all should aspire. And in the evenings, when families gathered on porches to watch the sun set over the wild, beautiful Oregon landscape, parents would tell their children the story of how a cowboy had stood up for a nurse accused of being a spy, how he had proved her innocence, and how that act of courage had led to a love story for the ages. It became legend, the kind of tale that defines a place and a people, that reminds everyone who hears it that courage and compassion and love can triumph over fear and hatred and injustice. It was a story that belonged not just to Owen and Ophelia, but to Jordan Valley itself, to the Wild West that had forged them both, and to everyone who believed that standing up for truth mattered, that one person's courage could change the course of history, and that love, real love, was worth every risk. The Wild West was a hard place, unforgiving and dangerous, where life could be brutal and short. But it was also a place where heroes could be made, where character was tested and refined, where two people could find each other against all odds and build something beautiful together. Owen and Ophelia Elridge had done exactly that, and their story would inspire generations to come, a testament to the power of love, truth, and unwavering commitment in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles.